Welcome back to Marxism, Schmarxism. It's been a couple of days. I've put a lot of reels on Instagram, posts on Instagram about the state, critiques of people. I've been having fun. Now I'm gonna go back to audiobooks because that's why I made this project, Marxism, Schmarxism. So I have today Lenin's Misreading of Marx's Critique of the Gotha Programme by Nick Rogers. This was published in a Journal of Global Faultlines. The publisher is Pluto Journals, and it was published in the December 2017 to February 2018 edition. So I'm accessing this on scienceopen.com. I got permission from Nick Rogers to upload it, and I'll put the link in the description. So here we will begin. Abstract. Lenin's The State and Revolution, written in 1917 on the eve of the October Revolution, introduced into Marxist theory the concept of socialism and communism as two different forms of post-capitalist society, defined by the distinct ways in which they distribute consumer goods. Socialism would distribute consumer goods on the basis of the amount of work citizens undertook and retain a state. Only communism would see the completion of the state's withering away and distribution according to need. This is a conceptual framework that, in the 20th century, was abused to justify Stalinist practice. Lenin based his theoretical innovation on Marx's discussion in the Critique of the Gotha Programme of two phases of communist society. In fact, there is no basis for Lenin's schema in the writings of Marx. A careful reading of Capital, in particular, demonstrates that Marx wrote no blueprints for how the future society should be organized. He only predicted that it would evolve. For Marx, the state is a political institution that begins to dissolve as soon as the workers seize political power and will not outlast class society. Introduction. Lenin spent much of the summer of 1917 in hiding, moving from safe house to safe house, then relocating to an isolated lakeside peasant hut not far from Petrograd, and finally escaping to Finland. After the semi-insurrectionary demonstrations of early July had ebbed, an orchestrated campaign accusing the Bolshevik leader of being a German spy allowed Russia's provisional government to take steps to suppress the Bolsheviks and imprison its leaders. Lenin took the precaution of preserving his freedom and possibly his life at the cost of removing himself from the center of political events. In Finland, Lenin spent much of his time writing up a substantial manuscript based on extensive notes he had taken the previous year. The topic was the attitude of Marx and Engels to the state and their view of what would become of this institution, or sets of institutions, following a successful workers' revolution. The resulting pamphlet was not published until 1918. By then, Lenin was head of government of the new revolutionary Soviet regime. Lenin's prestige as leader of the first national government, established with the explicit aim of building a new post-capitalist order, was to make classics of many of his writings for the millions who, in succeeding decades, were won to revolutionary socialist politics. The long pamphlet he drafted in August and September 1917 and published under the title of State and Revolution was to be one of these, and arguably among the most influential. It popularized concepts such as Engels' discussion of the post-revolutionary withering away of the state that until then had received scant attention within the mainstream politics of the socialist Second International. A commune state of the type pioneered for a few short weeks in 1871 by the Parisian revolutionaries was identified as the political form through which a workers' regime would rule. More fatefully for the future development of socialist politics in the Marxist tradition, Lenin's work also introduced an interpretation of the discussion in Marx's 1875 Critique of the Gotha Programme that this article contends misrepresented Marx's thinking. This is the idea that even after capitalism has been superseded, the cooperative, egalitarian, and democratic society for which socialists were striving must pass through two distinct phases or stages based on starkly contrasting distributive principles. To these phases, Lenin, in The State and Revolution, applied the terms respectively of socialism and communism. Ultimately, this newly minted conceptual framework was to shape the Stalinist Constitution of 1936, which defined the Soviet Union as a socialist society based on the principle allocating consumer goods to each according to his work. The idea that socialism and communism represented two different types of society, albeit on a continuum of evolutionary development, was to warp the theoretical thinking of all the parties that claimed descent from the Communist International established by the Bolsheviks in 1919. This includes the Trotskyist parties that broke with the Stalinized version of the communist tradition. Most significantly, the withering away of the state, rather than beginning as soon as the workers seized political control, was now relegated to a hazily envisaged, and probably far distant, future, which could only be reached after socialism had matured into full communism. Only then could consumer goods be distributed to each according to their needs. Yet in all of Marx's writings, the discussion of a first and then a higher phase of communist society occurs only in the critique of the Gotha Programme, a document written with polemical intent for a tiny audience. Nowhere do either Marx or Engels associate socialism with the one and communism with the other. In fact, Marx and Engels generally use socialism and communism as synonyms for the same future society, and Engels pointed out in referencing the Paris Commune that the state's withering away begins as soon as the workers seized political control. There are two footnotes here. At the beginning of their careers, socialist is often a descriptor of political trends they are criticizing from their communist perspective. And Friedrich Engels, Letter to Bebel, 18 to 28, March 1875, quote, "All the palaver about the state ought to be dropped, especially after the Commune, which had ceased to be a state in the true sense of the term," unquote. Continuing. Lenin's claim that Marx's first stage of communist society is usually called socialism implied that he was drawing on the concepts and terminology of early theorists. However, I have not identified an earlier use of the terms socialism and communism to make the distinction that Lenin draws in The State and Revolution. It seems to me likely that this was Lenin's innovation. There's another footnote here. Peter Hudis repudiates the interpretation that Marx's two phases of communist society represent two distinct stages that are respectively named socialism and communism as a staple of Stalinist dogma, but fails to trace the source of the dogma to Lenin's State and Revolution. P. Hudis, Marx's Concept of the Alternative to Capitalism, Chicago 2013, page 190. Tetsuzo Fuwa, whose work my attention has recently been drawn, does attribute the misinterpretation to Lenin. Tifua, Rereading, Critique of the Gotha Programme, Tokyo 2004. Continuing. Therefore, to Lenin falls the responsibility for an overly schematic interpretation that was ultimately to distort how socialists viewed Marx's thinking about communism and the nature of the transition to it. This article argues that theorists and activists who wish to learn from the Marxist tradition should do what Lenin did during 1916 and 1917 and return to the writings of Marx and Engels on the question of the state and communism, always, of course, with a critical eye. In particular, they should engage with a gap in Lenin's research project during those months in 16 and 17, Marx's Capital, which has much light to shed on the mode of production Marx thought would replace capitalism. The State and Revolution. Lenin's The State and Revolution is in many ways a remarkable document. Written on the eve of the Bolshevik insurrection of October 1917, it explains how the ultimate objective of a workers' revolution was to dissolve the very state power it aimed to seize. The document consists of 6 chapters. The first 5 are structured around quotations and analyses of the works of Marx and Engels. The 6th deals with the views of Plekhanov and Kautsky to expose how far they had departed, in Lenin's view, from the Marxist theoretical framework. However, it was not written as a plan of action for the coming revolution in Russia. In fact, the revolutionary events of 1917 receive only a handful of mentions in its pages. A proposed seventh chapter dealing with the Russian revolutions of 1905 and February 1917 was never completed. There's another footnote here. As Lenin reflected in a postscript to the first published version, quote, "It is more pleasant and useful to go through the experience of the revolution than to write about it." Lenin, The State and Revolution, 497. Continuing, The State and Revolution is part a work of theory and part a polemic aimed at Lenin's opponents in the Second International parties, who also claimed to adhere to the Marxist tradition, above all Karl Kautsky. It does not discuss Russia's atypical, from a Western European socialist perspective, political and social conditions and the special challenges these pose to Marxist revolutionaries. It was intended as a contribution to general socialist theory. The State and Revolution also served as a project of personal clarification. It had an origin in a 1916 dispute between Lenin and his fellow Bolshevik, the young theorist Bukharin, on the question of the state. Lenin had condemned as un-Marxist and unsocialist some of the formulations in an article by Bukharin that Lenin refused to publish. There are 3 footnotes here. See S.F. Cohen, Bukharin and the Bolshevik Revolution, for a discussion of the dispute. V.I. Lenin, The Youth International, a Review, December 1916. Nikolai Bukharin, Toward a Theory of the Imperialist State, in Richard B. Day, N.I. Bukharin, Selected Writings on the State and the Transition to Socialism, New York, 1915. Continuing, at the time, Lenin promised to examine the issue in greater length, and as a result of his reading and note-taking in a blue-bound journal that, as an anxious Lenin later reported to Kamenev, was left for a period of 1917 in Stockholm, came to conclusions that were much closer to those of Bukharin than he had anticipated at the outset. In a note to a 1925 edition of the article which initiated the dispute with Lenin, Bukharin writes that at the 6th Congress of the Bolsheviks held semi-illegally in Petrograd in July 1917, in Lenin's absence, Lenin's wife, Krupskaya, passed on a message. V.I. Lenin asked me to tell you that he no longer has any disagreements with you on the question of the state. There's a footnote here. Cohen says the message from Lenin was passed on in May, soon after Bukharin had arrived in Russia from America. Continuing, Lenin's central finding in The State and Revolution is that the state is a historical phenomenon associated with class society. It comes into existence with the emergence several thousand years ago of social stratification and hierarchy. It is an organ by which the ruling elite exercise political, social, and economic control over subordinate classes, especially the direct producers of the social product, that is, through most of history, the peasantry, but latterly, in the advanced countries of Europe and North America, the working class. The chief defining features of the state are its bureaucracy and its control of armed bodies of men, along with institutions of coercion of all types, such as prisons. When the working class revolution succeeds in creating a society in which everyone is a worker and none monopolizes the means of production to live off the work of others, classes would dissolve, since Marxists define classes by their relationship to the means of production. Then the state as an instrument of class control and oppression would also become redundant. Lenin quotes from Engels' The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, the same passage indeed that Bukharin had quoted in his article. Quote, "We are now rapidly approaching a stage in the development of production at which the existence of these classes not only will have ceased to be a necessity, but will become a positive hindrance to production. They will fall as inevitably as they arose at an earlier stage. Along with them, the state will inevitably fall. Society, which will reorganize production on the basis of a free and equal association of the producers, will put the whole machinery of the state where it will then belong, into a museum of antiquities, by the side of the spinning wheel and the bronze axe." Unquote. If the dispute with Bukharin spurred Lenin to embark on his research, it is those he describes as the opportunists of the socialist movement who are now the principal target of his ire, with the anarchists only a secondary target. Bukharin is not mentioned. Lenin observes that Engels' use of the phrase withering away in relation to the state in the famous passage from Anti-Düring has been misused to support gradualist, non-revolutionary approaches to social change. There's a footnote here with the quote from Engels, quote, "The proletariat seizes state power and transforms the means of production in the first instance into state property. But in doing this, it puts an end to all class differences and class antagonisms. It puts an end also to the state as a state. When ultimately the state becomes really representative of society as a whole, it makes itself superfluous. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and the direction of the processes of production. The state is not abolished, it withers away," unquote. Friedrich Engels, Anti-Düring, London, 1934, pages 308 to 309. Continuing. But Engels was talking not about the state created to defend the capitalist social system, the bourgeois state, but of the state the workers' revolution creates. This state is characterized by Lenin as the dictatorship of the proletariat, as a special coercive force for the suppression of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat. The dictatorship of the proletariat has caused considerable confusion down the years. Hal Draper has performed an important work of intellectual archaeology in identifying each occasion on which Marx or Engels mentions the dictatorship of the proletariat. He finds only 12 instances clustered in 3 time periods: post-1848, in discussions of the Paris Commune, and in Engels' latter years. Draper insists that Marx and Engels use the phrase exclusively as a synonym for a workers' state, or the political rule of the working class, what in the Communist Manifesto is called winning the battle for democracy. Draper speculates that Marx and Engels, consciously or not, turn to the phrase when engaging with the very revolutionary Blanquists, followers of Louis Blanqui, to differentiate the class rule the Marx Party advocated from the rule of a revolutionary elite for which Blanqui was organizing. For Marx and Engels, the dictatorship of the proletariat did not imply a special form of repressive rule. In fact, they also wrote of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie when discussing a wide variety of 19th century political forms, including democratic parliamentary republics. The word dictatorship had changed its meaning over the course of the second half of the 19th century. When Marx and Engels began writing in the middle of the century, it was most commonly associated with the Roman institution of dictatura and denoted a temporary period of emergency measures, which accorded with Marx's and Engels' view of the provisional nature of the post-revolutionary workers' state. By the end of the century, the modern-day usage of the word dictatorship was emerging, and even many Marxists began to misunderstand what Marx meant. This includes the Russian social democratic leader and theorist Georgy Plekhanov, who inserted the dictatorship of the proletariat into the 1903 program of the Russian Social Democratic and Labor Party, of which the Bolsheviks were a faction. Draper explores Lenin's confusion about the real meaning of the phrase in a number of Lenin's early works. He judges that Lenin used the phrase broadly correctly in The State and Revolution, although perhaps a special coercive force strays into the modern rather than the Marxist usage of dictatorship. There's a footnote here. In The State and Revolution, Lenin is confused about when Marx and Engels started using the phrase the dictatorship of the proletariat. He suggests they first did so after the Paris Commune, despite himself quoting Marx's March 1852 letter to Wedemeyer, which contains a reference to the phrase. Continuing, in the midst of the 1918-21 Civil War, when analogies with the terror of the French Revolution became a regular feature of Bolshevik parlance, Draper assesses Lenin and other Bolsheviks to have been less scrupulous in their use of the phrase. Chapter 3 of The State and Revolution deals with the lessons Marx learnt from the Paris Commune of 1871, as set out primarily in the Civil War in France published by Marx a few weeks after the defeat of the Commune. This event allowed Marx to begin to answer in concrete terms the question of what was to replace the bourgeois state. The objective was not to transfer the bureaucratic military machinery from one hand to another, but to smash it. The bureaucratic state, inherited from French absolutism and two Napoleons, was abolished by means of the election of all representatives who were subjected to instant recall, plus enforcing the payment of the equivalent of workers' wages for public servants. The standing army was replaced by the armed people. In fact, the defense of the cannons of the Parisian National Guard from seizure by the official government in Versailles was the spark for the revolt. No division between legislature and executive was recognized, quote, not the abolition of representative and elective principles, but rather their conversion from talking shops into working bodies, unquote. Lenin challenges the claim of leading German social democratic reformist Eduard Bernstein that the motivating spirit of the Commune was federalism by arguing that the Commune's plans for the election of a national government by communal authorities across France would have enabled both local initiative and centralism. Socialism and communism. For Lenin, the state and revolution was an opportunity to share his discoveries about the emancipatory ideas of Marx and Engels in relation to political power and the type of institutions the revolution would establish. It was an intellectual journey which brought him much closer to Bukharin's conception of the need to blow up the existing state, replacing it with a form of ultra-democratic political power modeled on the Paris Commune. Once a classless society is created, the need for institutions standing in any way separate from society and exercising coercive force becomes superfluous. Yet, just as he reaches these conclusions, Lenin takes one step back from the radical implications for revolutionary practice. Up until the closing paragraphs of Chapter 4, the role of the post-revolutionary state has been limited to defending the rule of the working class from its class opponents, specifically the capitalist class. Now, Lenin introduces an additional condition for the ultimate withering away of the state. Having explained that if democracy is a form of state, a stateless society implies the end of democracy, he is keen to clarify that democratic practice will continue. Quote, we do not expect the advent of a system of society in which the principle of subordination of the minority to the majority will not be observed, unquote. But how is the minority to be made subordinate to the majority in a stateless society? For the first time in the pamphlet, Lenin uses socialism and communism to signify different types of society. Quote, in striving for socialism, however, we are convinced that it will develop into communism and, therefore, that the need for violence against people in general, for the subordination of one man to another, and of one section of the population to another, will vanish altogether, since people will become accustomed to observing the elementary conditions of social life without violence and without subordination, unquote. This is a significant shift of emphasis. It is being suggested that organized violence by a set of institutions that may still be called a state will be necessary in a form of society called socialism and will only disappear at a later stage. Lenin then quotes from Engels' 1891 preface to Marx's The Civil War in France to the effect, in order to emphasize this element of habit, Engels speaks of a new generation reared in new free social conditions, which will be able to discard the entire lumber of the state, of any state, including the democratic republican state. The change of direction in Lenin's line of argument is made clearer in Chapter 5, the economic basis of the withering away of the state. Here, Lenin turns to consider Marx's critique of the Gotha Programme, abbreviated to the Critique in the rest of this article, written in May 1875 as a letter to Marx and Engels' supporters in Germany, the so-called Eisenachers in the German Social Democratic Workers' Party, criticizing the compromises they have made in reaching a unity deal with the supporters of the late Ferdinand Lassalle, organized in the General Association of German Workers, in the joint program that was to be submitted to a unity conference in the town of Gotha. The Critique is a document in which Marx goes into some detail, albeit in a condensed form, about the future communist society. However, we have to bear in mind that he is polemicizing against Lassallean formulations that he regards as ambiguous and open to non-revolutionary interpretation. The Critique was not intended to be a public document. His target audience was a handful of political leaders. In fact, a single copy was circulated in Germany and returned as requested to Marx. It was not published until 1891 when Engels made its contents public in the midst of a debate about a later party program. Nor was it what Marx would have described as one of his scientific works. His intention was to pound some sense into the heads of those who claimed to be his followers. First, Lenin broaches Marx's discussion in the Critique of the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx contrasts the Lassallean concept of a free state with what will actually happen to the state after the workers take power. Quote, "Between capitalist and communist society there lies a period of revolutionary transformation from one into the other. There is a corresponding period of transition in the political sphere, and in this period the state can only take the form of a revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat." Unquote. Lenin reiterates points he made in earlier chapters about the link between the state and class society. Quote, "Furthermore, during the transition from capitalism to communism, suppression is still necessary, but it is now the suppression of the exploiting minority by the exploited majority. A special apparatus, a special machine for suppression, the state, is still necessary, but it is now a transitional state. It is no longer a state in the proper sense of the word. For the suppression of the minority of exploiters by the majority is comparatively so easy, simple, and natural a task that it will entail far less bloodshed than the suppression of the risings of slaves, serfs, or wage laborers, and it will cost mankind far less." Unquote. But he then returns to the theme with which he closed Chapter 4, the potentially antisocial behavior of individuals, and adds, quote, "We are not utopians, and do not in the least deny the possibility and inevitability of excesses on the part of individual persons, or the need to stop such excesses. In the first place, however, no special machine, no special apparatus of suppression is needed for this. This will be done by the armed people themselves, as simply and as readily as any crowd of civilized people, even in modern society, interferes to put a stop to a scuffle or to prevent a woman from being assaulted. And, secondly, we know that the fundamental social cause of excesses, which consist in the violation of the rules of social intercourse, is the exploitation of the people, their want and their poverty. With the removal of this chief cause, excesses will inevitably begin to wither away. With their withering away, the state will also wither away." Unquote. Lenin has added a powerful caveat to his previous discussion of the state. It is no longer merely an instrument of class society, but additionally serves the role, even in the residual form of the armed people, of mitigating the excesses of individuals. Even in a classless society, only if these behaviors disappear will the state also disappear. It is after adding this new definition of the role of the state to Marxist theory that Lenin introduces his innovatory interpretation of Marx's two phases of class society. In the Critique, Marx dismisses various formulations in the Unity Programme, such as the proceeds of labor belong undiminished with equal right to all members of society, and a fair distribution of the proceeds of labor, as effectively waffle. Quote, "Proceeds of labor is a loose notion which Lassalle has put in place of definite economic conceptions. What is fair distribution?" Unquote. Marx points out that the various collective social requirements must be met from the total social output: reserves to cover unexpected events, investment for expanding production, administrative expenses, education, health, and provision for people who cannot work, before the new society can consider the distribution of consumer goods to individuals. How, then, is this distribution to be organized? Marx suggests that in a communist society that has only just been established, and which is, quote, "still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges," unquote, and quote, "the individual producer receives a certificate from society that he has furnished such and such an amount of labor, after deducting his labor for the common funds, and with this certificate he draws from the social stock of means of consumption as much as the same amount of labor costs. The same amount of labor which he has given to society in one form he receives back in another," unquote. Marx makes a comparison with the exchange of commodities, quote, as far as this is exchange of equal values, unquote, and concludes that, quote, equal right here is still in principle bourgeois right, unquote. This provides Marx with the opportunity to lambast the Lassallean concepts of fair distribution and equal right. Quote, this equal right is still constantly stigmatized by a bourgeois limitation. The right of the producers is proportional to the labor they supply. The equality consists in the fact that measurement is made with an equal standard, labor. But one man is superior to another physically or mentally, and supplies more labor in the same time, or can labor for a longer time. And labor, to serve as a measure, must be defined by its duration or intensity. Otherwise, it ceases to be a standard of measurement. This equal right is an unequal right. Further, one worker is married, another not. One has more children than another, and so on and so forth. Thus, with an equal performance of labor, and hence an equal share in the social consumption fund, one will in fact receive more than another. One will be richer than another, and so on. To avoid all these defects, right, instead of being equal, would have to be unequal, unquote. However, communist society is not static. There will be multiple phases, quote, but these defects are inevitable in the first phase of communist society, as it is when it has just emerged after prolonged birth pangs from capitalist society. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-round development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon from bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, unquote. Lenin, 3 times in as many pages in The State and Revolution, insists that Marx's first phase of communist society is usually or commonly called socialism, and that, to the extent that bourgeois law remains in place, quote, there still remains the need for a state, which, while safeguarding the common ownership of the means of production, would safeguard equality in labor and in the distribution of products, unquote. Only when there is complete communism will the state wither away completely. Moreover, Lenin explains how the critique has set out the barriers that must be overcome in realizing such a society. An enormous increase in the productive forces, the end of the division of labor, and the transformation of the nature of work so that people will work entirely voluntarily without any need to be incentivized. This will mean that, quote, there will be no need for society, in distributing products, to regulate the quantity to be received by each. Each will take freely according to his needs, unquote. Until then, Lenin insists, quote, the socialists demand the strictest control by society and by the state over the measure of labor and the measure of consumption, unquote. Lenin even makes the claim that in a socialist society, the state should be defined as bourgeois. Quote, of course, bourgeois law in regard to the distribution of consumer goods inevitably presupposes the existence of the bourgeois state. For law is nothing without an apparatus capable of enforcing the observance of the rules of law. It follows that under communism there remains for a time not only bourgeois law, but even the bourgeois state, without the bourgeoisie, unquote. There's a footnote here. Perhaps this is in part a reversion to the position Lenin adopted when debating Bukharin in 1916. Then he referred approvingly to, quote, the revolutionary social democratic attitude towards the bourgeois state and towards using it against the bourgeoisie to overthrow the bourgeoisie, unquote. Lenin, The Youth International, a review. Continuing, this is certainly a bold application of dialectical logic, but we have moved a long way from a post-revolutionary semi-state that withers away with the dissolution of class society. Lenin has replaced that conception with a 2-phase transition to communism. The period of the dictatorship of the proletariat is to be followed by a socialist society in which, although there are no longer conflicting classes, there remains the need for a state until people have learned, quote, to work for society without any rules of law, unquote. Lenin has set high barriers to the withering away of the state, the vanishing of individual excesses to the extent that rules are followed by habit, and such an increase in production that individuals can take freely from the stock of consumer goods. Marx's vision. Does the concept of a bourgeois state without the bourgeoisie find support in the critique of the Gotha Programme? Remember, the critique explains that the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat was the form taken by the state during the transition between capitalist and communist society. Well, Marx was very clear that the first stage of communist society, although, in his memorable phrase, still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges, is nevertheless a communist society, quote, based on common ownership of the means of production that, quote, does not acknowledge any class distinctions because everyone is just a worker like everyone else, unquote. Quote, furthermore, within the cooperative society based on the common ownership of the means of production, the producers do not exchange their products. Just as little does the labor employed on the products appear here as the value of these products, as a material quality possessed by them, since now, in contrast to capitalist society, individual labor no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of total labor, unquote. This is a society that has superseded commodity production, the law of value, and markets. The fetishism of commodities that veils real social relations is no more. Even the critique's first phase of communist society is a society which has made a complete transition away from capitalism. There is no logical basis to be found in the critique for arguing for a continuing role for the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. The proletariat no longer exists, let alone a surviving bourgeois state. The bourgeoisie no longer exists. Marx poses what is precisely the relevant question, quote, what transformation will the state undergo in a communist society? In other words, what social functions will remain that are analogous to the present functions of the state, unquote. Marx was famously averse to setting out prescriptions for the future society, as Lenin emphasizes in The State and Revolution. Marx and Engels distinguished themselves from utopian socialists such as Charles Fourier and Henry de Saint-Simon, who drew up detailed blueprints for how society could be organized. In Marx's view, the most perfect plan for the future would not get humanity one jot closer to achieving it unless there was a material basis in the existing society that made such a future viable and achievable. Marx focused on identifying that material basis in capitalism. Marx's single most important scholarly and scientific work is Capital. It is certainly the work to which he devoted the bulk of his intellectual life. Capital is an attempt to discover and describe the main laws of motion of the capitalist mode of production. It does not describe an actual capitalist society. A mode of production is an abstraction, what we would today call a scientific model that attempts to capture the most important features and dynamics of a particular type of society that finds expression in a variety of different social formations. Critically, for Marx, a mode of production is a historically limited phenomenon. Like everything in our universe, a mode of production has a beginning and an end. Its laws of motion not only describe its behavior, but should also say something about how it comes into being, evolves, and ends. So Capital contains a lot of historical material about the birth of capitalism, and Marx constantly refers to modes of production that preceded it and continued to overlap with it and to interpenetrate it. It is not a surprise, then, that a fairly constant object of the discussion in Capital, often implicit but not infrequently explicit, is the mode of production that Marx thought capitalism was bringing into being. That, after all, was the point of Marx's approach to the communist society he discussed in the Critique, or what can be more scientifically described in Marxist terms as the communist mode of production. It could only come into being on the basis of the capitalist laws of motion, that is, the creation of a class of propertyless producers, the proletariat, the socialization of labor and cooperation within the workforce, which brings workers together and unleashes the potential for ever-increasing productivity. and the concentration and centralization of production. Nowhere in Capital does Marx talk about two distinct phases, stages, or forms of communist society, nor much about the political transition, although obviously capitalism and the emerging mode of production would overlap and interpenetrate. Given his conception of what a mode of production is and what it is possible to say about a mode of production that does not yet exist, it would not have made sense for him to do so. However, Marx does see the future mode of production, as do all modes of production, as inevitably evolving. In the third volume of Capital, Marx writes about the realm of necessity, which he stresses continues within the future communist society, that is to be replaced by the realm of freedom. Quote, "The realm of freedom really begins only where labor determined by necessity and external expediency ends. It lies by its very nature beyond the sphere of material production proper. The shortening of the working day is the basic prerequisite," unquote. And in the very first chapter of the first volume of Capital, Marx writes of the society he describes as, quote, "an association of free men working with the means of production held in common and expending their many different forms of labor power in full self-awareness as one single social labor force," unquote. There's a footnote here. Marx Capital, Volume 1, pages 171 to 172. Quote, "Let us finally imagine, for a change, an association of free men working with the means of production held in common and expending their many different forms of labor power in full self-awareness as one single social labor force. The total product of our imagined association is a social product. One part of this product serves as fresh means of production and remains social, but another part is consumed by the members of the association as means of subsistence. This part must therefore be divided up among them. The way this division is made will vary with the particular kind of social organization of production and the corresponding level of social development attained by the producers. We shall assume, but only for the sake of a parallel with the production of commodities, that the share of each individual producer in the means of subsistence is determined by his labor time. Labor time would in that case play a double part. Its apportionment in accordance with a definite social plan maintains the correct proportion between the different functions of labor and the various needs of the associations. On the other hand, labor time also serves as a measure of the part taken by each individual in the common labor, and of his share in the part of the total product destined for individual consumption. The social relations of the individual producers, both towards their labor and the products of their labor, are here transparent in their simplicity, in production as well as in distribution," unquote, and continuing. This passage gives us a more balanced perspective on Marx's discussion in the critique of the distribution of consumer products. In the critique, he is making a polemical point against Lassallean formulas. There's a footnote here. Marx, Critique of the Gotha Programme, quote, "I have dealt more at length with the undiminished proceeds of labor on the one hand, and with equal right and fair distribution on the other, to show what a crime it is to attempt, on the one hand, to force on our party again, as dogmas, ideas which in a certain period had some meaning, but have now become obsolete verbal rubbish, while again perverting, on the other, the realistic outlook which it costs so much effort to instill into the party, but which has now taken root in it, by means of ideological nonsense about right and other trash so common amongst the Democrats and French socialists," unquote. Continuing, in Capital, a strictly scientific work, it is clear that he is not setting out a blueprint of any kind. Marx makes virtually all the substantive points about the organization of communist society that he later repeats in the passages dealing with that society's first phase in the critique. The need to allocate resources for social requirements before producing for consumption, distributing consumer goods according to the quantity of work producers have undertaken, how the role of labor time in such a distribution nevertheless leaves social relations transparent, in contrast to the fetishism of commodity production. But he is not prescribing how a future society should distribute the things they produce. That will depend on the level of social development attained by the producers. The distribution of consumer goods according to labor time is assumed only for the sake of a parallel with the production of commodities. No suggestion that such a distribution involves bourgeois law. There's a footnote. It is worth noting that the first volume of Capital went through several editions after first publication in 1867 that incorporated substantial edits by Marx. These include two German editions that came out after the 1875 critique, an 1883 third German edition, and an 1890 fourth German edition that were both published posthumously, but incorporated changes Marx had stipulated. It is not possible to claim that the critique is Marx's last word on the question we are investigating. Continuing. Even in the critique, Marx cautions against making distribution the basis of defining any given mode of production. Quote, "It was in general a mistake to make a fuss about so-called distribution and put the principal stress on it. Any distribution whatever of the means of consumption is only a consequence of the distribution of the conditions of production themselves. The latter distribution, however, is a feature of the mode of production itself. If the material conditions of production are the cooperative property of the workers themselves, then there likewise results a distribution of the means of consumption different from the present one." Unquote. Concepts such as labor tokens had been advocated by Robert Owen, among others. In Capital, Marx is generally sympathetic to Owen, his cooperatives, in this proposal. He emphasizes that Owen's method of distribution, in contrast with the proposals of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, would not be money. Quote, "On this point, I will only say further that Owen's labor money, for instance, is no more money than a theater ticket is. Owen presupposes directly socialized labor, a form of production diametrically opposed to the production of commodities. The certificate of labor is merely evidence of the part taken by the individual in common labor, but Owen never made the mistake of presupposing the production of commodities." Unquote. There's a footnote here. Marx, Capital, Volume 1, 188, footnote 1. See also Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 2, page 434, quote, "With collective production, money capital is completely dispensed with. There is no reason why the producers should not receive article tokens, permitting them to withdraw an amount corresponding to their labor time from the social consumption stocks. But these tokens are not money. They do not circulate." Unquote. Continuing. Similarly, the slogan, "From each according to his ability to each according to his needs," which Marx does not use anywhere in Capital, was not an invention of his. Similar formulations, that in turn mirror biblical phrases, were in relatively common usage in the socialist movement. Nor is it clear that distribution according to need implies unrestricted access to consumer goods, as assumed by Lenin and most subsequent Marxists. After all, systems of rationing can take need into account, child benefits and the National Health Service being contemporary examples under British capitalism. The point is that in Capital, Marx only permits himself to draw the very broadest outlines of a future communist mode of production, basing himself solely on developments within capitalism. Thus, an increase of production within a communist society is conceivable, given what capitalism has already achieved. The end of exploitation is conceivable once its basis in the separation of the immediate producers from the means of production is ended. Also conceivable is a shortening of the working day that would allow society to approach the realm of freedom, although Marx cautions that initially this will only be made feasible by reallocating the large number of workers who under capitalism perform functions that will have no use in the society. Quote, "If tomorrow morning labor were universally to be reduced to a rational amount and proportioned to the different sections of the working class according to age and sex, the available working population would be absolutely insufficient to carry on the nation's production on its present scale. The great majority of the now unproductive workers would have to be turned into productive ones." Unquote. Somewhat in contrast with the more bucolic image in the German ideology of hunting, fishing, rearing cattle, and riding all in the course of a single day, in Capital, Marx discerns in machinery and large-scale industry the possibility of ending monotonous repetitive work and the division of labor. Quote, "Large-scale industry, by its very nature, necessitates variation of labor, fluidity of functions, and mobility of the worker in all directions. But on the other hand, in its capitalist form, it reproduces the old division of labor with its ossified peculiarities. This possibility of varying labor must become a general law of social production, and the existing relations must be adapted to permit its realization in practice. From Marx's perspective, the solution to Lenin's barriers to the achievement of full communism, increasing production, ending inhuman, mindless specialization, the division of labor, and creating purposeful work that people will want to do, already exists within the capitalist mode of production. However, when and how a future society overcomes those barriers, and what specific solutions it will devise to these and the other problems it encounters, can only be determined by the members of that society. That precept applies also to the question of what social functions will remain that are analogous to the present functions of the state. The state, as defined by Marx and Engels, and also by Lenin for the bulk of the State and Revolution, is an institution of class society, and under the rule of the working class already in the process of becoming the administration of social processes by society as a whole, i.e. not a state at all. To suggest, as Lenin does, that individual excesses, defined by Bukharin in his and Preobrazhensky's 1919 The ABC of Communism as sloth, slackness, criminality, pride, must wither away before the state can do so, and that economically a condition of absolute and complete abundance must exist, is to turn Marx and Engels' definition of the state on its head. There's a footnote here. Bukharin and Preobrazhensky, The ABC of Communism, page 75. Quote, "Manifestly, this will only happen in the fully developed and strongly established communist system, after the complete and definitive victory of the proletariat, nor will it follow immediately upon that victory. For a long time yet, the working class will have to fight against all its enemies, and in especial against the relics of the past, such as sloth, slackness, criminality, pride. All these will have to be stamped out. 2 or 3 generations of persons will have to grow up under the new conditions before the need will pass for laws and punishments, and for the use of repressive measures by the workers' state. Not until then will all the vestiges of the capitalist past disappear. Though in the intervening period the existence of the workers' state is indispensable, subsequently, in the fully developed communist system, when the vestiges of capitalism are extinct, the proletarian state authority will also pass away. The proletariat itself will become mingled with all the other strata of the population, for everyone will be by degrees come to participate in the common labor. Within a few decades, there will be quite a new world, with new people and new customs." Unquote. Continuing, "For now, the state is no longer just a feature of class society, but is required in all societies where individual behavior of which society does not approve might occur, or where society must in any way ration its use of social resources. Such conflicts and behaviors and the need to make economic choices are likely to be present in all human societies, and if society cannot design mechanisms to deal with them without relying on an institution separate from society and repressive of it, then the Marxist vision of a stateless society is utopian." There's a footnote. The fact that existing egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies manage without a state while coping with errant individuals on whom harsh sanctions are sometimes applied, and resource conditions short of absolute abundance, suggests that the vision of a society without a state is far from utopian. Continuing, consequences. There is not a straight line of historical causation between Lenin's Chapter 5 of the State and Revolution and what became of the October Revolution. By the 1930s, the Soviet Union suffered under a repressive state seeking to control all aspects of society, applying a harsh labor discipline at work and sanctioning nothing in the way of political liberty or human emancipation. Lenin's pamphlet was not published until 1918, and its ideas would have taken time to disseminate. The intention of the State and Revolution as a whole is to advocate a libertarian vision of post-revolutionary society. Indeed, the first months after October 1917 saw an explosion of popular democracy in Soviets, factory committees, and all aspects of society. Grassroots pressure forced the pace in social and economic developments until approximately June 1918, when a general nationalization decree was issued from the center in response to the start of the Civil War, to be followed in short order by the harsh policies of war communism. It was the devastation of the Civil War after the catastrophe of World War, the failure of revolution to spread to Western Europe, and the small size of Russia's working class, on which the new regime depended, compared with the country's peasantry, that played the decisive roles in the degeneration. Yet, since a workers' revolution and the transition to a communist society is conceived by Marxists as a conscious political act, in contrast to transitions between previous modes of production, the conceptual framework that informs that political act matters and plays a material role in how events turn out. The key problem with Lenin's misreading and his addition of a stage he called socialism to the Marxist conception of the transition to communism is that, during the decade between October and the final Stalinization of Soviet society, it opened up a space for ideas that were inimical to making a priority of restoring and strengthening democratic forms. A focus on democracy during the period of transition to a new society would have been the only way of creating the preconditions for a society of freely associated producers. But if the ultimate objective was building socialism, and socialism as defined by Lenin in the State and Revolution retained a state, then it was legitimate to classify the state sector of the economy as socialist. There's a footnote here. I leave to one side the critical question of how much progress was possible to a classless society in an isolated country with a peasant majority. Continuing, those were exactly the terms which informed the thinking of all sides during the economic debates of the 1920s. Such a conceptual framework made it more difficult to resist the post-1928 Stalinist program of collectivizing agriculture and forcing the pace of industrialization, whatever the effect on respectively the peasants and the workers. For was not the extension of state control of the means of production progress towards socialism? Indeed, Lenin in the State and Revolution talks about the objective of making all citizens into the employees of one huge syndicate, and of transforming the whole of society into a single office and a single factory, albeit under a democratic state in which accounting and control is practiced by the whole population. The problem of how it is possible to facilitate local control and initiative if the economy is treated as a single monolithic unit is seriously under-theorized by Lenin and remains a challenge for Marxists today. An economy that is effectively a single factory minus the commune state is at most a small step from the Stalinist model of society. At the 18th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1939, Stalin not only claimed to have built socialism in the Soviet Union, but also declared that it was a mistake to believe that the state could even begin to wither away under socialism. It was something of an irony that a Congress, declaring the achievement of socialism, was organized by a party that claimed to lead a class that, if a classless society really had been achieved, would no longer have existed. The logic that the withering away of the state should be accompanied by the withering away of parties of the working class is inescapable, but in my experience rarely, if ever, pursued by party theoreticians. Stalin's take on Lenin's misreading was embedded in the programs of parties under Stalinist influence and propagated around the world. It became most people's idea of what socialism and communism were, particularly the conflation of state ownership and socialism. Any project that seeks to build on the original vision of Marx and Engels must take a critical approach to Lenin's equivalent project of 100 years ago. And that's the end of the audiobook. Thank you.